Everyone. My name is Sarah Morris, and I'm the head of instruction and engagement at the Emory University Libraries. And I'm excited to be here today, though I'm certainly sad we can't all be together at the conference and engaging with one another. I did just want to thank the organizers for providing us with the opportunity to still share out our presentations and ideas with all of you. I'll hopefully look forward to hearing from some of you, and I hope this can spark some ideas and discussion and conversation after the fact. So what I'm going to be presenting on today is empathetic assessment, strategies and techniques for creating a user-centered assessment culture. And this is a topic I've definitely been interested in for quite a while, thinking about just with the huge amount of different types and methods of assessment we all engage in at our libraries, thinking about how user-centered techniques and empathy can play a role in that and empower librarians in their assessment work and help us better understand our users and patrons at our library. I think this can be really more important now than ever, given the COVID-19 pandemic, the realities of social distancing, and the fact that many of us are having to engage in sort of remote teaching and learning at the moment. I think finding ways to connect with our populations and our students and faculty and to just better understand their circumstances and try to include that into our programming design going forward, again, can be really more important now than ever. So a little about me. As I mentioned, I currently work at the Emory University Libraries, and I previously was an assessment librarian at the University of Texas at Austin. And I definitely have a long-running interest in incorporating user-centered techniques and approaches into library assessment and just exploring the different forms of library assessment and how empathy can come into that in a lot of different ways. And as I mentioned, I think we're all right now dealing with having to rethink a lot of our instruction, outreach, and assessment during the pandemic. So hopefully this can spark some ideas and be a way just to think about different types of assessment techniques that can help us reimagine our programs or just better connect with, reach out to, and design experiences for our users in very challenging circumstances. So today I want to first unpack empathetic assessment as a concept and examine how empathy can be incorporated into different library assessment techniques. Following from there, I wanted to explore concepts from the world of design thinking, particularly empathy interviewing, which is a technique that's often utilized in design thinking practice. Building from there, I wanted to highlight a case study of a program I ran with my colleague Melanie Kowalski here at Emory. And this program was a design thinking for library instruction, where we got a cohort of librarians together, step through the design thinking process and explore different concepts and techniques, including empathy interviewing. And that program actually resulted in some different techniques and ideas around assessment at our libraries. I also wanted to then highlight some ideas and strategies that you can hopefully explore at your own library around more empathetic assessment and then incorporating empathy and sort of user-centered practices into your assessment techniques. And this is particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and shifts we're dealing with in remote teaching and learning. And finally, just to highlight some next steps and some ways to continue the conversation. As I said, I am sad we're not all together in person where you'd normally be engaging live during the session, but I would very much like to hear from you and hope this can spark some conversations going forward. So to begin with, I wanted just to unpack some ideas, background, and concepts around empathetic assessment. So libraries obviously engage in a huge amount of assessment and a lot of different types. And assessment can involve a lot of different questions for us as well, whether it's a matter of timing, so when to send out that survey, the audiences we're trying to learn more about or engage with, the methods we choose to employ, different guiding questions, or just overall goals of what the assessment is and what we hope to get out of it and learn as we're gathering this information and data. And libraries obviously run a lot of different types of programs, and we engage with audiences in a lot of different ways, which can result in a huge amount of assessment. We're constantly trying to gather information and data to make data-informed decisions to improve our programs. So we might have assessment that looks at an entire program or offering. We might look at, say, an individual class or a workshop or a specific event. Assessment can happen during the course of an experience, sort of formative assessment, such as a quiz or a check-in during a class. We could also have assessment that concludes, say, a semester or an entire learning experience, such as a workshop series. We might look at attendance numbers. We might look at satisfaction with an experience, at student learning outcomes, or even at usability for our website or different online learning objects like LibGuides. So there's a lot going on. We're doing a lot. We're getting a lot of information. We're trying to figure a lot of things out about our audiences. And I think that empathy could come into play in a couple of different ways here. I wanted to highlight sort of two concepts. The first is affective assessment. And this is assessment that can take a look at a student's interests or attitudes or values. It can be a way to get a sense of how students are feeling about library spaces, or their confidence level in conducting research or completing a research project, or what they're interested in studying. In many respects, affective assessment can give you a snapshot of an individual and just reveal a bit more about who they are, what's driving them, what are their interests, are they having any challenges, how they're feeling about a particular thing or at a particular point in time. And this can just be really added insight into our different populations, including student populations, and provide us with some different things to think about with how the library can best support a given population, whether that's through instruction or through outreach. I think this affective assessment techniques can often provide sort of a more holistic view of a group or a population or even just an individual. Related to this is more user-centered design approaches. And this is program design that just focuses on users at pretty much every stage of the development process. So no matter what it is you're doing, whether you're planning an orientation event or you're developing a class or you're designing a website, you're constantly thinking of your target audience and who they are and what their needs might be and what you hope they can get out of this. So all of these processes together really just seek to keep users in mind and to better understand their experiences, their needs, and their particular interests. And all of that can be folded into other types of assessment techniques we might engage in to just give us a better understanding of our populations and who we're serving with our programs and our programming, and how to develop said programs to best meet people's needs and interests and hopefully resonate with them. So design thinking can come into play here as a sort of problem-solving, iterative process that has emerged initially from the sort of world of design. Though it's certainly found its way into education circles and into libraries. At the end, I have a couple of links and resources if you're interested in reading more about design thinking and how it can connect to libraries in some really interesting ways. But it's essentially a very user-centered and holistic approach to identifying a problem and then developing a solution with a user in mind. So there's a couple of different steps to the design thinking process. The first is to empathize, and that's just really where you seek to understand your user or your set population to learn more about them. And through those conversations and that process, you can then move on to defining a problem. So ideally through those conversations, those interactions, as you learn more about a user, you can figure out if there's a challenge they're facing or something they need, and you define that. You next will move on to ideate, which is really just brainstorming solutions to whatever problem you've identified. And really sky's the limit with the brainstorming. Sort of go nuts, have fun, toss everything out there to see what sticks. After that process, you will select one idea and then prototype it out. So you build something, you test it out, you get user feedback. In the test phase, you're seeing, does this work? Is this resonating with my chosen audience or population? And you get more information, and then you often can go back and start the process over again. Through that information, you might need to do some refining or some tweaking. You might see a new problem that's cropped up that you need to deal with. So design thinking can be incorporated into libraries in a lot of different ways, including instruction and assessment. And what I want to focus on now is empathy interviewing, which is a key part of the design thinking process, and I think is something that can work really well within library assessment. So I wanted to next highlight a project case study we did at the Emory University Libraries around design thinking and how empathy interviewing played a pretty key role in that project. After attending a design thinking training at Emory, my colleague Melanie Kowalski and I applied for an internal grant to fund a PD program, and we were successful with that. And this program was designed for librarians and to look at incorporating design thinking principles into library instruction. So the idea is that during the program, we would all walk through the design thinking process together, but with a sort of instruction, experience, or project in mind. All librarians came with a project to develop. This could be a class session or a workshop or an online resource guide, anything sort of to do with instruction. During our 6-week program, librarians engaged in empathy interviews, either with a student, this could be a grad student or an undergraduate, or a faculty member, in order to gain insight into the target audience for their project. So for example, if someone was developing a class session for sociology majors who are undergraduates, they would seek out some sociology undergraduate majors and conduct an empathy interview with them just to learn more about that student population. And this can provide insight into their project or program development and just help them make sure whatever it is they're working on has a user in mind and is being developed with users in mind. So empathy interviews are pretty unstructured. You typically ask a relatively broad question and then just let someone talk fairly uninterrupted. And you just listen carefully and take very detailed notes. We had everyone work in pairs in our design thinking professional development program. So we had a designated note taker and a lead interviewer who listened, asked the questions, and would help move the conversation along as necessary. Sometimes, you might get off in the weeds or the conversation kind of naturally peters out, and so you can kind of keep it going with the lead interviewer. But the idea was to ask, again, these pretty broad questions. We often have people who didn't mention the library at all in the interview. They didn't ask anything about it. They were trying to get at who this person is, sort of what's going on with them, what are their interests, those kind of affective assessment ideas. And the interviews were actually incredibly revealing at times because people would generally start just sharing their experiences in general about their life at Emory, their program, their studies, what's going on with them. And we'd often hit upon topics that might not come up in a more traditional survey or learning outcomes assessment. For instance, in surveys, we're often asking about very specific library spaces. Per se, you want to learn about how people are, using a computer lab you've set up, or times a day they tend to come to the building, or how they're using group study spaces. But with this empathy interview, we were getting a lot more about just challenges people were having, how their life was in their program, what they were studying and working on, what excited them. So all of that could help form just a more holistic and nuanced picture of a certain audience or a certain user or a student population. So the empathy interviews we engaged in were really just designed to help individual librarians get deeper insight into a particular audience so they could design more user-centered programs and instruction experiences. And as I said, a lot of times we didn't even mention the library in the interviews. Some questions people used were, what brought you to Emory? And just let someone tell their story about how they came to be at Emory and what their experience has been. We also had some people ask, what has your experience been in your program, say with grad students, and just let them talk about, their studies, their challenges, how they're juggling lots of things, their research interests, and just sort of let them go from there. We couldn't always do something about the issues raised, which could be frustrating sometimes. And it's also hard to not want to include every single thing you heard in the interview into your program design. It can be tricky to kind of, sift through it, maybe indicate what's going to be most relevant for you and your particular project building and project development circumstances. But the idea was just to get people talking and to learn more about their experiences at Emory more broadly, and to use those insights just to help us inform our program and get into sort of the habit of mind of keeping our users in mind, checking in with them, engaging in something like an empathy interview, just to learn a little more about them and think about them as we're developing programming for a target audience. Empathetic assessment can work on a broader scale as well. So after our design thinking program, which ran in the fall of 2019, we had a working group who was looking at undergraduate experiences at the libraries. And we ended up conducting these sort of one-question whiteboard surveys at different campus libraries and spots. And this was just to gain insight into students' lives. We asked about challenges, and we asked, what can improve your life right now, and just let people go. Some people replied with fairly cheeky or funny responses, but a lot of people provided really insightful thoughts and were willing to share. And again, it wasn't always something we could do anything about, but it helped us to learn more about our students, about what's going on with them. Maybe it could inform programming at the library, or lead us to form a new partnership or share something with someone else across campus, and just think about how to support and serve our populations better. So all in all, I think a lot of people who went through the program really found the empathy interviews to be a really valuable part of the experience. Not every aspect of design thinking lined up neatly with the type of work we do with the developing programs or developing instruction experiences, but the insights from the empathy interview, the practice, just taking some time out to connect with and talk with students and learn more about them, I think proved really valuable for everyone involved in the program. And it's certainly something we hope to do more of in the future. That being said, a lot of our original plans to scale and incorporate more empathetic assessment practices into our assessment endeavors and techniques and methods we use were disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic and our shift to remote teaching and learning in spring 2020. So the challenges we're facing though right now, particularly around remote instruction and the need for social distancing, I think make connecting with and seeking to understand our populations and our students more important than ever. So empathy, affective assessment strategies, user-centered design principles can all be really crucial in our current circumstances, as we are often having to rethink certain programs and offerings right now. I think taking the, carving the time and space out to better understand and connect with our users, our students, our faculty, whoever we're serving in our libraries, can be really powerful and can help us ensure we're keeping them in mind as we're maybe developing new things or testing new things out right now. I know there's a lot of experimentation going on at my library, as I'm sure there is at yours. So I wanted just to shift now to think about some strategies and ideas for user-centered assessment that you could hopefully deploy at your own libraries and test out. The first is just making empathy interviewing part of your workflow. So this could be a traditional empathy interview setup. I will say it can be labor intensive. It's in a one-on-one setting. The way we did it in our program, we had 2 people attending each interview. So there's issues of scale there, but the insights and feedback we got, even if it was just chatting with a few people and just getting some ideas to kind of mull over and think about in your project development work, in your instruction, program planning, or class design, or whatever it is you're working on, I think proved incredibly valuable. For scale purposes, though, I think you could think about, say, with a focus group or a group conversation, just taking some cues from empathy interviewing and design thinking. That could be asking these sort of broader questions, these affective questions about how people are feeling, what brought them to the program or your institution, what's going on in their life right now, and including that into, maybe other questions you might be asking, say in a focus group if you're trying to learn more about a particular library space, for example. So having all those things play together and fold that into one experience, I think can give you a more holistic view of your audience and just be a way to include kind of the spirit of empathy interviewing and the types of really open-ended questions that are intended just to spark, someone telling their story, sharing, feeling comfortable, sharing about their experiences. I think those are all great things to include in even group conversations or sort of focus group setups. One example of something that came out of one of our empathy interviews that was really unexpected. We were talking with a series of graduate students in a program and just really having very broad questions, learning about their experiences. We ended up learning that an awful lot of people are juggling a lot of family responsibilities, whether it was elder care or child care. And so that helped us then think about the times of day we were scheduling programming and making sure things are available for that student population and thinking about how to engage with them more effectively. So it might not be something that would necessarily come up in an exit survey for a workshop program always, but having that insight into the responsibilities of our students we're juggling in that program helped us design with them in mind a bit more. So again, this can just be things to think about to gain insight into your students, learn a little more about them, and just hopefully think about ways to connect with and design programming for them that can be effective. You can engage in quick feedback via, say, whiteboard surveys or street surveys that, again, ask these really broad empathy interview inspired questions just to check in, see how people are feeling, see what challenges are going on, see what's interesting to them right now. That can all result in really interesting and user-centered programming at your library. And sometimes you could hear something unexpected. You might have, an overall student population that kind of is consistently one way, and then you can hear something a bit different from someone else that can lead you to think, okay, are there other stories to uncover here or things to be considering, and just really trying to constantly think about what different users are experiencing at your library. Also, incorporating empathy into more traditional assessment formats can, I think, be really powerful. So we were talking some about affective questions. These are things you can include on surveys and feedback forms, asking about confidence levels, concerns, personal goals, etc. That can all be folded into other types of questions just to give you some different insights into students and to different populations. And I think making assessment and user-centered approaches a key part of programming. So, anytime you're working to maybe design a new workshop program, maybe doing some pre-assessment, doing some empathy interviews, doing a little focus group and getting a sense of, your target audience needs, interests, any challenges they might be facing, just to help you with that design process. And then always, doing a post-assessment, seeing how people like the programming. Did it land with them? Did it resonate with them? Are there ideas for future iterations of it, so that you're, again, constantly involving users in program design and conversation, and just keeping them and their experiences in mind in whatever it is you're developing. So I think empathy interviews, focus groups, usability testing, all of that, it's typically done in person, and a lot of it really does hinge on a personal connection or just creating a really comfortable and welcoming space for sharing. The idea with empathy interviews, of course, is to get someone talking and sharing freely and just letting the conversation flow. And I know that can be challenging as we're all dealing with social distancing and remote learning experiences at our universities. But I think empathetic assessment practices can still happen in remote environments. It's something I'm eager to experiment with this summer and to see what works and see how I can best connect with users and learn more about their experiences right now. So you might include more affective assessment questions on the survey you're sending out. You can experiment with conducting empathy interviews online using Zoom and see how that works. Providing quick ways just to check in on students, get their feedback, let them know the library is interested in their experience. Anything like that, just to forge a connection and just get some insights, I think can be really powerful and even meaningful. for students and populations you're seeking to engage with in different ways. I think empathetic assessment practices and gaining insights into our populations, again, it's definitely more important now than ever as we navigate a lot of uncharted territory, as we are having to maybe deal with shifts in programming we've traditionally offered and or developing new programs to meet our new challenges and needs of our populations. So all that being said, I think empathy, thinking about users, seeking to connect with them, and even just learn a little more about their experiences can be a great way to ensure that we're thinking of them and designing program that resonates with our different populations. So I'm definitely eager to hear your ideas and feedback and see how we can continue this conversation. I'd love to hear about your experiences, your ideas, things you've been doing with assessment. I feel like normally in the presentation right now, we'd be breaking for questions and live discussion, but please feel free to get in touch if you have any ideas, and super eager to continue the conversation and hear from all of you. Before closing out, I did just want to highlight a couple of resources and links I put here. The first, if you're interested in learning a bit more about design thinking more generally, I included a link to a handbook on design thinking in libraries that provides some really interesting insights into how design thinking principles and practices and philosophies have sort of found their way into libraries. We were obviously talking a little more about assessing programs or events or instruction activities and learning more about users, but design thinking can play some interesting roles in space assessment in libraries as well, and that's sort of included in the handbook. I also included a link to an overview of design thinking from IDEO, which provides just a bit more kind of foundational background information on just what design thinking is, how did it emerge, sort of what industries this gone to in its explosion in popularity. So you can read more about that there. And the last two links are about empathy interviewing specifically. There's sort of tips and techniques, suggested questions, some best practices to keep in mind from Stanford's D School and from the University of British Columbia's D School as well. I will say one of the hardest things about empathy interviewing is really just listening. Is very difficult not to kind of interject and engage sometimes and turn it into a conversation. So they have some suggestions on that and how to kind of structure the experience to encourage just free flowing sharing and conversation, and hopefully just to learn a lot about the particular person you're interviewing in that space. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you again to the organizers for providing this opportunity. My email is there if you'd like to get in touch, and I look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you. Thanks so much.